I'm very disappointed to see that you people didn't do as much drinking last night as I thought you would, because the attendance is pretty good. I'm expecting a lot of very good attendance here. And this topic is probably the most economics-oriented of all the topics I've seen on the schedule, but so I'm going to try to address myself to more a general audience. I realize that the economists are a minority in the audience here. But the topic that Hans asked me to talk about is errors of public choice. And I thought I'd give you a sort of a 5-minute historical background about what public choice is about. What the word public choice means for those of you who are not economists or familiar with this. It has to do with the fact that in economics there were a number of what economists call revolutions in the 20th century. Most of you are familiar with the Keynesian revolution, but there was also somewhat of a theoretical revolution in the theory of competition. It was known as the perfect competition revolution, in which the way in which economists thought of the most fundamental concept in economics, competition, changed. From the time of pre-Adam Smith on, competition meant rivalry, entrepreneurship, price cutting, differentiation of products to try to please consumers. Advertising was a part of it. Economies of scale through large-scale production was viewed as another way to compete by dropping your costs. And then in the early 20th century, that changed as the economics profession tried to mimic physical sciences. And they came up with a model of competition that could be expressed in mathematical terms called perfect competition. And it had these assumptions behind it of many firms, you had many firms, but a few firms, homogeneous products and prices, free entry and exit in the industry, and perfect information. Consumers were omniscient and businesses were omniscient in terms of how to go about providing goods to consumers. And so this model, these assumptions were taken literally by a lot of economists as this is what the ideal world looks like. And so what the economics profession did was to set up what the economist Harold Dent says a long time, which is a totally unrealistic, unachievable world. And that led to another revolution in economics called the market failure revolution. Because the method all throughout the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s in the economics profession was to look at this nirvana, this never achievable world of perfection, perfect competition, compare actual markets to it, and declare that markets have failed because they don't meet this unachievable ideal of perfect competition. And of course, markets were said to fail everywhere. If you read some of the older textbooks by Paul Samuelson, for example, who was the biggest selling textbook author in the world for roughly from 1948 into the 1980s, he taught generations of students that the only really competitive markets, I think, he said, were natural gas and cotton, because they're homogeneous, natural gas, cotton. They seem to fit this idea. Everything else is a monopoly of some kind or another. So you have 40 or 50 years of college students taught this nonsense of market failure. And there's a famous book that was sort of a summary of the state of the art. It was published in the 1950s by Francis Bator, B-A-T-O-R. It was called Anatomy of Market Failure. And it was, and so that's where the economics profession was when you get into the 1960s. It was pretty much a recipe for interventionism. And what public choice was all about was some of the pioneers were my professors, James Buchanan and Gordon Tulloch, professors of mine in graduate school. And there were colleagues of mine at George Mason some years later. I'll tell people that as soon as they learned I was at George Mason, they left Virginia Tech and moved to George Mason. But they were pioneers in that field. What they did essentially was to resurrect the way in which writers used to write about economic issues in terms of political economy and not divorcing economics from politics. And so what they did was take a lot of just old ideas that had been known for generations by political philosophers and others, and express them in the language of modern economics And the method was to say, okay, they accepted the market failure model. They said, well, we're not going to criticize that. However, we're going to analyze how governments work. And governments may fail even worse than markets. And so the method of analysis was to say that market failure is a necessary but not sufficient condition for government intervention. And of course, they talk about things such as political externalities. Markets are said to be filled with externalities, pollution, and so forth of all kinds. Well, there are political externalities by definition in a democracy because you have all or none decision making. That means if we decide that in the U.S., for example, if we decide that our next president is Ron Paul, it will make the liberals very unhappy because government will be too small for them. And it will make the neocons very unhappy because he will not try to invade the entire planet with the U.S. military. And so all this unhappiness by the people who don't get their way to democracy is called a political externality. And it goes from the local dog catcher election, to if your dog catcher, animal control people were elected, to the president of the country, there are political externalities. And so, and they introduce such things as rational ignorance, the idea that the average citizen doesn't have much of an incentive to be informed about politics, therefore special interests will dominate politics. They recognize the fact that politics in a democracy is usually a matter of governments dispensing very highly concentrated benefits to small, concentrated, and politically effective groups, and then scattering the costs among the population with maybe a small tax per person that no one will ever notice. And that way, we don't notice. It's sort of like plucking a chicken one feather at a time. You don't really notice until you're standing there naked with a chicken and you don't know what happened to all my feathers. And so, and all of this, of course, has been expressed in mathematical models and very sophisticated-looking theories, but they're all pretty simple ideas. The inherent short-sightedness of politicians is a big part of public choice. That their main concern is always making themselves popular before the next election. And in the U.S. Congress, that's never more than 2 years away. And so there's an inherent incentive to spend now and worry later about where the money will come from, creating huge deficits, for example. So all of these things were good. Public choice, I was educated by the public choice pioneers, Gann and Tulloch. And so I'm not an overall critic of everything they've ever done, by any means. But what I'm going to have to say, and of course they developed the theory of bureaucracy also. Von Mises got there much earlier in his book on bureaucracy, but there was also a public choice version of the theory of government bureaucracy. But what I'm going to say is I have a number of critiques where I thought this whole area of research, which has generally been a good thing, certainly Buchanan won the Nobel Prize for it, and even George Stigler and Gary Becker, when they won the Nobel Prize in economics, they were known for work in public choice also, in addition to other things that they were known for. And so you could argue that there have been at least 3 Nobel Prizes awarded for this whole area here. But my main critiques of it are on certain areas of public choice that I think has gone astray and has even promoted interventionism in a big way, done the opposite of what it was most people think of it as doing. And one is the method of modeling the state as a firm. There's a lot of part of this literature that began in the 1960s and 70s and up to this day that attempts to just take the economist's theory of the business firm and say, well, the state is a kind of a business firm. There's even a book with the title, The State as a Firm. It was, I think, won a book award by the Public Choice Society many years ago. I remember being at a Public Choice Society meeting where this book was given an award, The State as a Firm. And there's a lot of talk about how, in this literature, about how political entrepreneurship is sort of similar to business entrepreneurship. After all, there are markets, they say, in politics. There's a demand for legislation, special interest usually, and there's a supply. That's what politicians do. They supply legislation, just like in markets. And George Stigler is especially known for saying this sort of thing, that politics is like markets, and some of his students are, and Gann and Tulloch and the rest did also. And I'll give you one example of how I think this can be grossly misleading, the think of the state as some sort of firm, a business firm, and as political entrepreneurs, as they're called, as being similar to business entrepreneurs. So some of the research that I've been involved in basically says that the big difference between what you might call a political entrepreneur and a private entrepreneur is private entrepreneurs, if they're successful, will actually expand wealth in the society. They'll create value for people. That's how they make money. When Bill Gates founded Microsoft and did what he did with Microsoft, he created tremendous value and wealth for the entire world, for that matter. Political entrepreneurs are involved in transferring wealth from one pocket to another. They're engaged in transferring wealth from one group to another and pocketing some for themselves at the same time. As I said in an op-ed I wrote on the website I write for, I stated the purpose of government in one sentence. And it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but now that I think of it, I think it's probably could qualify me as one of the great philosophers of the 21st century. I said the purpose of government is for those who run it to plunder those who do not. And I'm not sure I'm not the first one to say that, but I really believe that is the purpose of government. There have been many books written about the purpose of government, but I think that basically says in one sentence is so that those who run government can plunder those who do not run government. That's what we have government for, despite all the theories of market failure and public goods and stability and so forth. And that's what political entrepreneurs do. They organize the plundering of their fellow citizens. And one example of my research that demonstrates the sort of wrong-headedness, in my view, of some of the public choice literature is there's a literature on local government finance that makes the analogy between the theory of the business firm, which says many firms is a good thing, it means more competition. Well, in cities, we have different kinds of jurisdictions. You might have a city somewhere that has one metropolitan government. Say if Paris had one metropolitan government, there would be only one government, the government of the city of Paris. But you could have an alternative arrangement of the city of Paris and then different types of, in the U.S. we call them counties. You could have competing governments. And so the public choice literature has made an analogy between competing businesses in an industry and competing governments, so-called. And in the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of articles published in economics literature that pretty much concluded that the more governments you have, the better. In a metropolitan area, the more governments you have. But I looked at this and I was thinking, well, the more government you have, the more government you have. It's not necessarily a better thing, because this analogy doesn't necessarily work. And the flaw in this is that it's the flaw in a lot of mainstream economics, in that it relies too much on just theory and econometrics. And economists don't read anything. They come up with a clever hypothesis, and then they find some book with 10 million statistics in it, and they test the hypothesis, but they don't read anything, many of them, about the subject that they're talking about. And in fact, this whole business of the number of governments, I got into this by a colleague of mine, James Bennett, and I researched the subject of how governments respond to tax revolts. Do they just sit back and say, okay, the people have revolted, or we know they think the people are revolting, but no one said in one of his movies, the peasants are revolting. The King of France, do you remember that? And he said, sire, the peasants are revolting. And Mel Brooks, who was the King of France, said, they certainly are. But when taxpayers revolt, how do governments respond? Well, in America anyway, we found that they responded by saying, okay, we will obey your wishes. And then they would immediately get to work creating off-budget government enterprises where they could spend money anyway without the voters knowing about it. And I wrote a whole book about it. It's called Underground Government. In Britain, these things are called quangos, quasi-autonomous non-government organizations that are set up as vehicles for avoiding the eyesight, the view of voters and taxpayers. And so when I did this study, this research, I found that in America, we had lots of governments in a metropolitan area. It inevitably was a result of the fact of, over the decades, governments trying to evade the wishes of the voters. Whereas the public choice literature said exactly the opposite. They said, oh no, if you look at this table of statistics published by the U.S. Bureau of the Census, it says that, say, Minneapolis has 63 different governmental jurisdictions. That must be efficient compared to, say, New Orleans, which only has 20 governmental jurisdictions within the whole metropolitan area of New Orleans. Because after all, many firms means more competition, fewer firms means less competition. But I think in reality, the truth is exactly the opposite. If you had and these things are often called, they can be called counties, they can be called townships, they can be called, in America, they can be called special districts, special taxing districts, special authorities, public authorities, and all sorts of names for these things. And a lot of them have been really grossly inefficient. The largest bankruptcy in the history of municipal finance in America was in the state of Washington, where they used these off-budget enterprises to build 5 nuclear power plants. Eventually, after about 25 years, only one of them was actually built. The rest were scrapped, and they defaulted on $2.5 billion in debt at the time on that. So these things are even worse than normal government enterprises. But the public choice literature hails all this as efficient because there's many of them. And so that's one example of political entrepreneurship that leads to gross inefficiency, not efficiency. It's not at all the same. Another book I wrote with Jim Bennett was on the phenomenon of political entrepreneurship being used to actually give tax dollars to special interest groups, which they can use to lobby the same government for higher taxes and more government, which the government will do. They'll raise taxes and become bigger, and then give some of that money back to the special interest groups who will lobby for more government. If they succeed, government gets bigger, they give them more money. And so I had an article in the journal Public Choice about this called How Government Twists Its Own Arm, to explain this phenomenon. The book was called Destroying Democracy, published many years ago. But as far as political entrepreneurship goes, I guess it's not news to this group, that politicians work very hard, very smart, very diligently in figuring out how to avoid the wishes of consumers or taxpayers, and how to avoid these restraints. So they don't serve consumers. So this analogy between the state and the firm, I think, is totally wrong-headed and has led to all sorts of foolishness in economics. Another critique I have of the public choice literature is basically a critique of the Buchanan wing of public choice. Buchanan, of course, was the co-author of Gordon Tullock of the famous book, The Calculus of Consent, which is considered to be a landmark book. And he calls his wing of public choice constitutional economics. He calls himself a contractarian, some sort of language he uses. And so, well, what is this? For those of you who are uninitiated into this, I'll read you a few quotes from Buchanan and Tullock about, from the Calculus of Consent, actually, and their view of the state and the market. Here's a quote. The market and the state are both devices through which cooperation is organized and made possible, where 2 or more individuals find it mutually advantageous to join forces to accomplish certain purposes. They go on to say the public choice approach to the analysis of political decision-making incorporates political activity as a particular form of exchange, market exchange. And as in the market relation, mutual gains to all parties are ideally expected to result from the collective action. The political process may be interpreted as a positive sum gain, end quote. And believe it or not, this is considered to be part of the classical liberal literature. That the government, just like a market, right from the Calculus of Consent. And of course, for government to be efficient like markets in the same sense would require unanimous consent. Market exchange is mutually advantageous. Both buyer and seller are better off, otherwise they wouldn't engage in a commercial transaction. And they're saying that politics can be just like this also, not in all circumstances. Of course, they're not naive, but this is what they said, that the political process can be just like market exchange. And so you have the problem of, well, that requires unanimity. And of course, Buchanan and Tullock very quickly understood that while there's never unanimity in government, in fact, they don't say this, but I would say this, that if there was, you wouldn't need government, of course. If we all unanimously agreed on some course of action, we would voluntarily take that course of action. You wouldn't need government at all. And so, to keep making this argument that government is efficient, like markets go, they came up with the idea of relative unanimity. So, it's a 3/4 majority is better than a 51% majority, after all, or a 9/10 majority is better. But it's still not efficient. I mean, the fact that 90% of the people can plunder the other 10% doesn't really make it like a market, does it? If I were to buy your used car from you, I'm happy, I like the car, you like my money, who's getting plundered there? There's no plundering at all, there's no rip-off at all. So there isn't always in politics, no matter what the majority is. And so they played around for years with models of relative unanimity and policy recommendations based on it. And it didn't seem to catch on that much. I guess they must not have thought it was all that persuasive. And so Buchanan came up with this idea of conceptual unanimity. If we can't talk about actual unanimity, let's, and he really loved, a great revelation to Buchanan was when John Rawls published his book, A Theory of Justice. And he had this model of decision-making behind the veils of ignorance. And so Buchanan has written hundreds of articles that start out saying, imagine you're behind the veil of ignorance. What type of society would you choose? And of course, a clever political philosopher like James Buchanan can always come up with a scenario to make an argument where you would get unanimous consent to choose certain rules of the game that we would play under. And so, conceptual unanimity. Maybe I'll read some of what he says about this. This is Buchanan. To the contractarian, that law is legitimate and just, which might have emerged from a genuine social contract in which he might have participated. That law is illegitimate and unjust, which finds no such contractual basis. But he's not saying that there was an actual agreement among human beings. He says that basically the theorist can theorize that people might have agreed to something, then that law is legitimate. The social contract is best conceived as subject to continual revision and change, and the consent that is given for this change must be thought of as being continuous. He doesn't say why it must be thought of as being continuous. In other words, if governments continually change the rules of the game on their own without citizen participation, that must be considered as legitimate. And he says, even when an original contract may never have been made, in reality, when current members of the community sense no moral or ethical obligation to adhere to the terms that are defined by the status quo, and when such a contract may have been violated many times over, that while the status quo defines that which exists, hence, regardless of its history, it must be evaluated as if it were legitimate contractually. End quote. That's Buchanan. So that's what he means by conceptual unanimity. And so using this, Buchanan and others have gone on to make arguments that among the legitimate institutions are antitrust regulation, the welfare state. They model that as a form of insurance against being in poverty, all sorts of public goods arguments, higher education subsidies, zoning regulation, government takeover of the transportation system in the form of road socialism, the government operation of roads, and so forth. But the economist Leland Yeager wrote a really scathing critique of this whole segment of public choice some years ago, the Cato Journal, where he said, when you read these people using the word conceptual unanimity, just substitute the word no for conceptual and you'll know what they're talking about. If you want to know what they're talking about. And so they don't look at such things as the libertarian theory of class analysis, which began in the 17th century, actually, which modeled government as not a Marxian class analysis, but basically as net taxpayers versus net tax consumers. The people who are on net benefit from government basically plunder those who on net don't benefit from government. They ignore all that. They ignore the conquest theory of the state, which goes back centuries, and in terms of how states have actually been formed. Because they're primarily interested in these theoretical models of conceptual unanimity, not real model real theory, real history of how states have been formed. And Murray Rothbard had something to say about this. Some years ago, Hans sent me a copy of something Murray Rothbard wrote that he was asked by a foundation before the calculus consent was published to, what do you think about this? They asked him. And Murray wrote a big report on it. This is one little paragraph. He recognized that this wing of public choice, the Buchanan wing, the contractarian wing, is just a social contract theory. Here's what Rothbard said. A social contract theory of government can be used to place a stamp of approval on all or most of the actions of the existing government. For example, with Rousseau. Thus, the theory of the divine right of kings began as a check on government, as an order to the king to stay within the divinely commanded laws. But it was transformed by the state into a divine stamp of approval for anything the king might decide to do, end quote. And that's what a lot of this has done. Not all of it, but a lot of this contractarian literature, especially Buchanan, is a part of it. I went down this list of antitrust and so forth, and when he makes these arguments. Another wing of this type of thinking comes from the Chicago School. George Stigler and Gary Becker, they said they're known for work in public choice as well, and some of their students have it. And a lot of it is very good. I like it. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not criticizing all of public choice, but just some of these major segments that I think have actually supported all kinds of interventionism. And Stigler, in his approach to public choice, used a typical Chicago School approach that markets are efficient everywhere. And like Buchanan and Tulloch, kind of likes the idea that governments are like markets. Governments are like markets. And here's one thing Stigler himself said. In policy analysis, one may legitimately employ an alternative definition of efficiency that rests on the goals adopted by the society through its government. When a society wishes, for example, to give more income to a group than the market provides, we may surely analyze the efficiency with which this is done. In this view, every durable social institution or practice is efficient, or it would not persist over time. If it lasts a long time, it's efficient. And one example he gave in this article was the American sugar price support program. Price floors on sugar, which at the time he wrote this article, 1992, had been around for about 50 years, and it was responsible for about a $3 billion per year subsidy to a couple of hundred sugarcane growers in the U.S. And by virtue of the fact that it had been around for 50 years, meant it's efficient, just like a market, if a business establishes a particular practice in manufacturing, and that practice becomes imitated by competitors. Why is it imitated by competitors? Well, because it's efficient, which means it may help it reduce its costs and produce better products. So they keep it around. They keep doing it over and over again. It's efficient. Well, government is like that too, Stigler says. But I couldn't help but thinking that he says if society adopts programs that last a long time, they're efficient. So I did some Austrian school econometrics here, and I calculated that at the time Stigler wrote this article, Soviet communism was 75 years old, which means 50% more efficient than the sugar price support program. Also, slavery existed for over 80 years under the United States flag, which would make it approximately 60% more efficient than the sugar price support program. And of course, the largest democracy in the world is India, which would make it the most efficient place on the planet. Because it's been democratic for a long time. They've kept that system for a long time. And so I just think it just doesn't make any sense to make this phony analogy between markets and government on the basis of how long it's true in the market. In the market, you make it, if human beings make the same decision over and over again in running their business, why is that? Well, they think the benefits outweigh the cost of doing that. That's why they keep doing that. But in these other institutions, government is ultimately based on coercion and threats of coercion and intimidation and violence. Is that how Bill Gates got such a big market share? He coerced, intimidated, and committed violence against his customers and competitors? Of course not. But that's how the government keeps the price support program and all these other programs, including slavery, which was a government program. Government protected, government enforced for many, many decades all around the world. And so my time is running down here, but those are my main critiques. And I guess one final critique I'll make, since I have about a minute or two left, is that some other research I've done on so-called rent-seeking, which I think should be called plunder-seeking, is much better. It began as a research agenda of the consequences of trying to influence politics for income transfers, for lobbying for tariffs on imports, for example, would benefit the manufacturers at the expense of the consumers. But then there was a lot of rent-seeking done by the economists working on rent-seeking themselves. They decided, so they must have thought, well, gee, maybe there's a Nobel Prize in this. We're only coming up with a very small number of the cost of rent-seeking, like 1/2 of 1% of GDP. But what if we come up with 10% or 20% of GDP? That'd be a Nobel Prize in that. And so they started expanding rent-seeking to all sorts of business activities. And here's what one person says, Robert Tollison, a very well-known public choice economist, a former colleague of mine at George Mason. He said, the applicability of rent-seeking theory does not depend on a government-propped-up monopoly right. The domain of rent-seeking also includes institutional processes in the private sector. A well-known example concerns non-price competition among imperfectly competitive firms. Rent-seeking can readily adhere in a private setting. So there's after that there came about in literature on how advertising or product innovation, research and development, or rent-seeking. But rent-seeking was originally assumed as at best a zero-sum game. Money taken out of one person's pocket, albeit indirectly through tariffs or something, placed into another person's pocket, and probably a negative-sum game when it all boiled down to it. And so they look at that, and they look at something like product innovation, a company investing millions of dollars in research and development as rent-seeking. But it's just not the same thing. If a company succeeds and produces a great product that people like, they're creating great value. It's a positive sum result in society. It's not a negative sum result, a zero sum result. So that's why I think this is sort of rent-seeking on the part of the rent-seeking theorists, to try to broaden this to include advertising, product differentiation. And some of this literature even says, okay, if we think product differentiation and innovation is a bad thing, could be a bad thing, some of it anyway, rent-seeking. What's the solution? Well, we need stricter antitrust regulation. Economists named Keith Cowling and Dennis Mueller advocated a new government committees in the U.S. Congress that would monitor research and development and decide which kind should be permitted and which kind should not be permitted. And talk about opportunities for rent-seeking. That's that would create a mountain of lobbying to prohibit your competitors' innovation but allow your innovation. And so that's the final area I'll mention where I think some of this literature has really gone astray. But in this case, it's because of, I think, a misunderstanding of how markets work by relying too heavily on the mainstream or neoclassical model. If they were to rely more on the way the Austrian school thinks about competition as a dynamic rivalrous process, they wouldn't get involved in this kind of nonsense of trying to condemn capitalism in the name of rent-seeking, just like they condemn lobbying for a tariff. And so that's my list of complaints about public choice, the areas of public choice. I have more, but I'm sure you'll all be curious to find out what the